Hey Joel, I'm a long-time listener of your channel and I heard a story on a video a few months ago about a dead guy in a werewolf costume, and it reminded me of a creepy story of my own. I'm a bit of a slow writer, so it's taken forever to write it in, but here it is. Me and the boys were on a road trip from Scotland down to London for my pal's wee brother's stag do. Not a fan of the city, honestly. It's, well, London, and hang around Dawson or Camden for a few days as a tourist and you'll know exactly what I mean. And so normally I wouldn't be caught dead on a road trip down to that crap hole of a place, but all Jim's wee brother's Barry was getting married like, and for some cursed reason he'd asked Jim to be his best man and to bring his mates for the stag do. And it was kind of sad, actually. I found out later that Barry had moved down to London for his career, but hadn't really met anyone that he'd called a good friend, and his side of the wedding was looking as empty as a nun's body count. So us, being good boys, all piled into Jim's Vauxhall and made the trip from near Glasgow down to Kensington. Now, fun fact, did you know that there's a bar in Kensington that at least at one time was called the Cockpit? Unsure if it was one of those types of bars, but we tried to persuade Jim to make a stop there on our pub crawl, but he was having none of it. Now anyway, I'm rambling away like a twat, and the story isn't about the stag do, which went on like a charm, and same can't be said for the wedding. Effing Barry got cold feet at the last minute and called everything off, and he wasn't the flavor of the month for a while. Now this story is about the road trip. On the way there, before all the will they, won't they, no they bloody won't drama kicked off, I remember we were on some kind of back road just into England, but not the motorway. But there's no shiting way that I can tell the exact road and the exact junction with the precise detail that some of these lads who write into you can remember. It blows my mind, that does. Now what I do remember, though, was the hairy-fanged hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, holding up a sign that read, "Need to get to the werewolves of London. Will pay for petrol." Now me and the lads had a proper laugh at this, and it was May, so this lad wasn't on his way to a Halloween party or anything. It looked like he was just using the Werewolves of London song as a sort of joke to try and actually get someone to stop and give him a ride for the lulz. Now, I was driving at this point and I decided screw it. It'd make for a mad story to tell at Barry's wedding, so about 300 yards past the guy, I decided to pull in and ask the others if they were all good with bringing this comedy hitchhiker along with us. Hell, he seemed like a good laugh. Maybe he could tag along to the stag do in full costume. Old Ewan fretted the F about it like he always does. What if the guy's a serial killer? He's dressed like a werewolf. That's so unsettling. And I said that there were 4 of us and one of him, and no actual hitchhiking serial killer dresses like a movie monster to lure in his victims. And it seemed to me like giving this lad a ride was just about the safest thing we could do, except for leaving him to just eat our dust. Now, Jim and Andy were both up for it, so the arseholes voted that since it was my idea, I'd be the one to trudge back and offer him a lift. When I got out and shone a torch towards it, I was kind of surprised to discover that he hadn't started heading towards the car. Maybe he hadn't noticed us pulling in. The sun had set by now, and he probably had limited vision with that stupid party werewolf mask he had on. And so I shut the torch off and decided that I was going to have a little fun of my own. This guy was clearly down for some spooky shenanigans, trying to hitchhike as a werewolf, so I figured I'd sneak up on him and try to give him a scare before offering him the ride he'd obviously be grateful for. And so I snuck over the barrier onto the grass verge and snuck towards this weirdo hitchhiker. But before I did, I saw another car pull right beside the fellow, and the car's headlights were on and the hitchhiker had been standing under a street lamp, and so I had a good look at what was going on. A lad my age was driving, and it looked like he had a passenger around our age too. I saw him lean out and talk to the werewolf hitchhiker, and it looked like they were exchanging some good-natured banter. It seemed like the fellow was about to get his ride and we'd have to head off our way. And then I froze. From the bracken lining the road, 3 figures dressed in black, wearing balaclavas, snuck around the back of the car. One of them yanked the passenger out and tossed him onto the verge, and then started kicking him ferociously. Another one of the black-clad men kind of got the first guy to settle down, then they must have restrained or tied the passenger up or something, and sort of marched him off the road and onto the grass, so he wasn't in any danger of getting hit, I guess. Now, meanwhile, the other black-clad figure was having a tough old time with the driver trying to drag him out of the vehicle, and then the werewolf hitchhiker pulled out what looked to be a pistol and aimed it at the driver. Cue another beating, another tying up, and the driver being thrown into the grass siding to join his mate. The werewolf ripped his mask off, and I got a bit of a look at his face, and he had one of those sort of lip scars. You know, the ones that you get from corrective surgery as a wean, and I guess he didn't think any witnesses were around to catch his face. Suddenly, I was bricking it, because I realized that they were going to drive right past our idling car, and God knows what they'd do if they thought that we were witnesses. And imagine my relief when the carjackers gunned the engine and did a 180 on that empty road and then shot off in the opposite direction. I ran to check on the driver and his passenger. They were bruised and the passenger had been seemingly knocked unconscious, but the driver was just about awake. He gave the same story we'd had. This guy dressed as some comedy cartoon werewolf was clearly not going to be some threat, and it was actually a pretty clever way to put people at ease. I realized it worked the opposite way too. We'd all just been too adamant that this guy was safe that we didn't even consider some ploy. I managed to get some phone reception and immediately called the police. And then I called Jim back at the car and told him what had happened, and cue the lads all calling me variants of the C word as if this was my fault. Long story short, the cops told us that this was the third instance nearby of someone dressed as some furry hitchhiker using this comedy value to kick off a carjacking. The first two cars had been found burned a few miles away. No idea what the purpose was, and the same thing ended up happening with this latest car I found. I kept in touch with the driver, invited them to the stag do too, but they weren't really feeling up for it, obviously. We made it to the hotel at like 9 in the morning and with one hell of a story to tell Barry. He seemed kind of distracted, even when the drinks were flowing and we were partying hard late that night, but obviously that was the old cold feet. Can't blame him for not being blown away by our story when he was planning on ditching his bride at the altar. I still think that was a prick move. Anyway, moral of the story is this: don't pick up any kind of hitchhikers. The harmless ones might just be the most dangerous, and if someone's dressed like a predator, maybe believe them. I see it all over the internet. Those stupid YouTube thumbnails of Dog Man, which definitely isn't just a werewolf given a name so he becomes some creepypasta. All those stories on the Chans and the Reddits and the pastas, you know the ones. Probably one of the most overused cryptids in my opinion because he's only supposedly to be found in Michigan, although people apparently see him all over and apparently people love him. Now I wonder how they'd feel if they knew that there is a dog man out there, or at least there was, and he's no cryptid. He called himself Dogman, and he's very human, and he's more dangerous than any made-up creepypasta monster you could think of because he's real, and I know it because I've met him. It was about 7 years ago, and me and the bestie decided to set off on an extended spring-summer road trip from Michigan to Flagstaff, Arizona. We were off to visit our other high school bestie who'd just graduated college in Arizona and moved into her own place. Her boyfriend was on deployment, so she was going to be staying in the new place alone. Now cue our selfless act of going to stay with her on vacation. On the way, one of our overnight stops was a motel in Woodward, Oklahoma. Now sorry for all the place names and all of that, but they're relevant to the Dogman legend, I promise you. And it was a particularly hot month, so we were out sunbathing by the pool until pretty late into the evening, and then there had been a group of kids playing in the pool itself, and they must have ranged from around 8 years old to 12, and maybe made up of a few different groups of travelers who'd stopped at the motel, and one of them we found out later was the son of the motel owners. The kids were mostly ignoring us, playing with the pool noodles and toys, talking about whatever kids that age talked about back in 2019. Now, not quite the skibbity toilet or 6-7 years yet there, but Occasionally thought that you could tell that a couple of the older kids were eavesdropping on our conversations, particularly when we talked about our plans of taking a walk into the woods just outside the motel. It seemed like a safe area, and we both felt like a late-night stroll. We've been fairly into camping in our college days, so a quick walk through the undergrowth with flashlights as the midnight hour dawned seemed suitably fun. Now, one of the kids, the motel owner's son, as I found out later and said previously, swam over to the edge of the pool and kind of lurked there for a bit. I could tell he wanted to say something to us, but was just too shy or nervous or hormonal to speak to a couple of sunbathing women. Now, eventually I took pity on him and asked him if he was having a good summer or something like that. The kid perked up at the attention and kind of mumbled that, yeah, he was having a good time. And then he just blurted it out. We shouldn't stay out after the sun had gone down, and we shouldn't go walking in the woods after dark. The sun was already beginning to set, so I asked him why. And over at the other side of the pool, I could see the other kids whispering to each other. They weren't giggling or acting like this was some kind of prank, though. They seemed genuinely serious as they spoke to each other. I asked the kid talking to us why we should be so careful. Was it a rough area? Were there wild animals in the woods, etc.? And the boy looked at me with absolute dead seriousness and said that Dogman was out there. Now, I kind of started laughing a lot about this and then realized that he was looking genuinely hurt and serious. And I told him that Dogman wasn't real, and even if he was, he supposedly lived in Michigan, where we were from. Now, he replied by saying that Dogman is definitely real, and I could ask his parents, who ran the motel, if I didn't believe him. Obviously, I wasn't going to start asking the motel owners about creepy pastas. I'd look like a total weirdo. And instead, I asked the kid if there were any other dangers in the woods or if it was just this Dogman. Now, he said it was just Dogman, and this Dogman kept everything else away. Now, I tried to reassure this kid by telling him that because we were from Michigan, Dogman's home state, we knew how to handle him and he wouldn't hurt us. And the kid looked very skeptical about this, but eventually just shrugged and swam back to his friends. Now, cue a few hours later. It had gotten cold, so we had gone outside, showered, and then changed into some light hiking gear. Both of us kept joking about running into Dogman and about whether there was a werewolf prowling the area. We were maybe 2 weeks away from a full moon, so we figured things were pretty safe, if, werewolves had been even real. Now, we knew there was a picnic spot in the woods for motel guests, so we decided to follow the trail leading there, and then use that as a base of sorts to head into the deeper woods. As we followed the trail, I noticed a sign lit up by the beam of my flashlight, and it read something like, "Picnic area ahead," but then there was a bunch of smaller text underneath. I got closer to read it, and it said something about how the motel owners strongly advised guests to stay on the trail and only use the area during daylight hours. It said that they weren't responsible for any guests who explored the woods after dark, and that the land beyond the picnic area was public land and not maintained by the hotel owners. And so the kid had been right, at least, that his parents advised people not to explore the woods after dark. That was very likely an insurance/safety thing, though. Heck, maybe they told their kid about a Dogman to keep him from getting into danger himself. That probably was the case. And we reached the picnic area, which seemed like it would have been nice in the daytime, making a note of which compass direction we were heading in and pushing forward into the woods in the direction that seemed the most accessible. We'd been walking around 20 minutes, taking in the nature, mostly the occasional owl or other unidentified birds, and it wasn't exactly a pretty forest, at least in the night, and the motel owners had certainly been right in that it wasn't well maintained. My friend kept worrying about twisting her ankle or cutting her leg on the tree branches, so we were discussing about heading back. And that's when we saw movement all around us. An animal. Well, multiple animals running noisily through the forest in the dark, making no effort to disguise their presence. And then we heard a bark, and both looked at each other, clearly thinking the same thing. More barking followed, and from what I could gather and make out, there were 3 dogs running around in the forest just a ways from us. They didn't seem interested in us, but they were certainly interested in something, barking and growling in general. It was hard to tell, and I didn't want to draw too much attention to us, but I did use the flashlight to try and spot the animals, since they would have clearly been able to smell us and attack if they were going to. From what I could tell, they were Rottweiler-type dogs, a couple black and tan ones, and then another that looked to be mostly tan. Now, the main point is, they were all very big dogs. One of them was smaller than the others, which is how I could tell the two black and tan dogs apart, so I took that one for a growing pup. Now, I've been so focused on the dogs that I didn't hear the rustling through the undergrowth or the sounds of footsteps until they were almost on us. And then, a huge man with a filthy coat and an almost glowing white beard burst out of the trees. His face was a mask of fury, at least what I could see of it behind the beard and without shining the flashlight straight into his face. He was holding a huge walking cane, about as tall as he was, with a bulbous wooden knot at the top, which looked like it could do some serious damage. And when the guy spoke, he had an accent that didn't quite sound American and also spoke like he wasn't used to talking much, almost like his vocal cords didn't get much of a workout often. The guy demanded to know what we were doing in his woods, especially two young women, and why we were so comfortable being in danger. I started to splutter some kind of response, which he completely ignored and whistled for the dogs to come to him. The three dogs, confirming my theory of how many there were, came bounding through the undergrowth and settled at their master's side. The biggest one was kind of foaming and drooling at the mouth as if he'd been on the verge of a catch or a kill, and they sat there obediently, but I could tell that they were wired with energy and desperate to be set free by their owner again. Now, I started to speak again, but one of the dogs growled, almost warning me, and so I quickly fell silent. The old man started croaking at us that we were effing stupid B-words for walking in the woods at night because wasn't it obvious that something terrible was going to happen to us? And he didn't have time to protect everyone. And besides, his dogs were animals after all. They might mistake us for something else, and then there'd be nothing he could do. Now, I started shaking at this as I saw all three dogs staring at me. Maybe I was imagining it, but it looked like they were staring hungrily now, staring at me specifically too, and not my friend. And then, the old man told us that we needed to leave the way we came immediately, and that he was releasing his dogs to go back to their patrol. If they mistook us for something else, then that was on us. We were already turning to run before we heard the man tell his boys that they were free to go play. And thinking back, I'm not sure if running was actually a good idea. It might have given the dogs more of a reason to follow us. In fact, the youngest one did start chasing after us for a little bit, and to this day I don't know if he meant to do us harm or was just thinking we were playing. Now, when we reached the picnic area, the dog just stopped, like he knew that he wasn't allowed to cross the boundary into the motel's land. And we didn't stop running though, and it's a miracle neither of us had injured ourselves by the time we sprinted back to our room. Now, we barely even had the energy to discuss what had happened. We both collapsed into our single beds, half-dressed, and slept until morning. And the next day on checkout, a teenage girl was handling the desk, and we hadn't seen her before. It had been an older man when we checked in who said that he was the owner, and I could see the family resemblance, though, between the owner, this girl, and the kid who'd spoken to us at the pool. Now, I very sheepishly told her that we'd gone walking in the woods and encountered a guy with these very vicious dogs. Now, the girl's face went kind of white, at least how I remembered it, and then she composed herself again. She explained that everyone just called him Dogman, and he patrolled the forest every night with a constantly changing rotation of dogs. Nobody really knew how many dogs he had or where he lived and kept them, but she knew that he had at least 15. And she told me that her dad knew more about the guy, but would never talk about him, and that he just drummed it into his kids that they were to absolutely avoid Dogman at all costs and call the cops if he ever came into the motel property. And then she kind of glanced at a photo on the wall, so I went over to examine it. And it was an old army photo, Looked to be from maybe the early 2000s, and it was a platoon led by a guy who I could clearly recognize as the motel owners, but quite a bit younger. But it was the guy on the far left who caught my attention. He was staring off into the distance, not looking at the camera like the rest of the unit, and in his hand he held a harness attached to a military dog that sat beside him. One of those dogs that sort of sniffed out mines, I figured. Now, the teenage girl remarked that it was a photo of her dad when he served in the army, just before he was honorably discharged and opened this place. She didn't comment on the man that I'd seen, the bearded soldier who bore more than a striking resemblance to Dogman. And the girl added one final thing. She told me that Dogman allegedly patrolled the forest every night with his army of dogs to prevent an unnatural occurrence. Everyone in the area knew he was unhinged, but they had no idea if or how he was dangerous. No local law enforcement wanted to go searching the deep woods for a man and his army of dogs, and honestly, I can't say that I blame them. And so next time you hear about the Dogman creepypasta, know that, yeah, there probably isn't some werewolf prowling Michigan, but somewhere in Oklahoma, there is a man that they call Dogman, and he's definitely someone to avoid. I'm willing to bet that I'm one of your older listeners at a grand old age of 67, and ever since I could talk, I'd tell my dad to put his rock and roll records on, and my entire family and I knew that music was in my blood. Guitarist, lead singer, hell, even drummer, they were in my future. Instead, I'm a retired accountant, but with how tired I feel these days and how much my joints ache, I'm not sure that the rock and roll life would have been for me. Now, I may not have found superstardom in a band, but I did attend plenty of concerts in my day. Bands who've split up, bands who aren't even alive anymore, some of the live shows I've seen could make you spit with jealousy. And the concert I was attending when this event happened was a show on Kiss's The Alive tour, and I can't even remember where the venue was these days, only that it wasn't the infamous Detroit show. Now, the problem with concerts back then was that I was 17 and still didn't have my license. Now, I was, according to our driver's ed teacher, the biggest liability behind the wheel that he'd ever seen, and I think I'm a bit of a better driver these days. Now, anyway, the point was, I could drive myself cross-country to see these shows, and my friends were into lame crap like Simon and Garfunkel or Bob Dylan. Of course, I realized these people weren't lame crap at all these days, but back then, I was all about the rock, baby. And so nobody wanted to spend 3 or 4 days in a car with me to chauffeur me to a concert they didn't even want to watch. And this meant that my best method of travel was taking the Greyhound bus. However, that cost money, and I was a broke high schooler, so I took the second best option, hitchhiking. I'd hitched a bunch of times when this happened, and everything had gone fine, which is a small miracle when you think about it. But my luck was about to run out when that old beaten-up red Volkswagen camper van pulled up, and I could see a long-haired guy in the driver's seat, and it looked like he was wearing an AC/DC shirt. Sick. And then the door slid open, and I saw the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen in all my life. She was the kind of girl you dream of when you're a 17-year-old boy, and then I saw another guy in the back, and my heart fell. He was obviously her boyfriend. Now, the girl asked where I was headed, and I told her that I was headed to the Kiss concert. It turns out that was exactly where they said they were going, and she said that I was welcome to ride with them as long as I didn't mind putting up with her annoying brothers. So, no boyfriends then, I guess. I didn't mind. I didn't mind at all. I was some 17-year-old kid. Drugs and rock and roll were on my mind pretty much all the time. And that's why I was totally psyched when, as soon as we got back on the road, the girl offered me a joint. I'm going to call her Janice because in my head at the time she reminded me of Janis Joplin. The other two guys can be Peter and Will, younger brother and the driver. Janice was quick to light up and seemed intent on filling the van with as much weed smoke as possible. The windows were closed, so it didn't take long before we were hotboxing ourselves, laughing at the stupidest crap. And I remember talking rock and roll and being a little surprised that the rock trio didn't really have much in the way of opinions when it came to rock music. Now, eventually, the joint had been smoked to within an inch of its life, and that's when I noticed it. The van stank. And I mean, it really stank. I'd never smelled anything like it, and it was suddenly so strong that I can't believe that even the weed masked it. And I'm telling you, it smelled like Sodom and Gomorrah in that vehicle. Not that I know what Sodom and Gomorrah smelled like, but I imagine it was exactly like that. Now, I don't know how to describe it. It was like the rot mixed with death, mixed with lavender, mixed with perfume and incense, and the lingering smell of weed. Throw in Peter's BO, which I suddenly realized was almost intolerable as he moved across the seat to me. And how could these people tolerate this and with the windows closed? I wasn't exactly the most hygienic clean freak. I was a teenage boy with crusty socks tucked under my mattress. And boys, you'll know exactly what I mean by this, but this stench was too much. Suddenly Will looks back, taking his eyes off of the road for an alarming amount of time, and asked Janice and Peter if they thought Daddy was going to be okay. Now, okay, they weren't apparently siblings, and I know girls still call their fathers Daddy right into adulthood, but it was weird as heck to hear two grown men talking about Daddy. Peter insisted that this Daddy could look after himself. Janice started lamenting how it might affect Daddy because of the tragic events that happened to someone called Charlie. Now, I tried to insert myself into this conversation here, asking if Charlie was okay and if he was a member of the family. Janice giggled and told me that they didn't know Charlie, but they deeply loved him. The problem was that Daddy felt spiritually free while Charlie was allowed to work, and now he'd been usurped by the man. I got this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I wondered if there was any chance they were talking about Charles Manson, and that Daddy was maybe one of his followers or acolytes who hadn't been caught or identified. Filled with idiotic teenage bravado, I decided to simply ask, acting as if I was some big fan of the murderous cult leader. Now, I had gone through a period where I tried to convince myself his music was good, so I wasn't totally lying. And instead of acknowledging me, Janice made it pretty clear that she didn't want to address the topic when she announced that it was way too hot in the van and how could any of us stand it. I just sat there as a teenage boy in awe as she stripped away her t-shirt, leaving herself completely bare-chested. I was a little taken aback at the cigarette burn scars that I could see on her body, but at least they looked old and healed. Janice made a big show of pretending that she hadn't noticed the effects that she had on me, but I could tell that she enjoyed the reaction because she kept asking me questions to direct my attention towards her and give me an excuse to look. The questions started out innocent enough, like how many girls had I made out with? 3, but I told her 8. Had I been with any of them? Yes, which was true, although it was the most awkward moment of my life for both of us, and to this day I'm not even sure if it really counts as such. And then she asked me if I'd ever hurt anyone. I said that yeah, probably, by accident, but she said no. Had I ever really hurt anyone, like caused serious damage to another person? I said that no, I hadn't. Janice giggled and said neither had she, but that Peter had some stories. Peter, who was about 5'6" and skinny as a rake, didn't exactly look like the dangerous type, but you never know. Janice told me that I should take a look over the back seat to see the gift that they were bringing Daddy. My nose had acclimatized to the smell of Satan's sweaty butthole at this point, but as soon as I leaned over the back seat, it was like being hit with an olfactory WMD. I can't even describe the smell, but I can describe the source. If you're squeamish, maybe stop listening for 30 seconds. In the storage area of the VW was a clear plastic box filled with some kind of animal entrails. Now, the unidentified meat was crawling with maggots, some of which were just starting to emerge as flies. And I studied for as long as I could, trying to determine whether I was looking at a human body. I couldn't see any bones or anything besides rotting chunks of meat, and Janice asked me if she thought Daddy would like it. I had no idea what to say. I didn't want to offend these people and end up in that bucket, and at the same time I was somehow still taking in the sights Janice was offering. She was drawing my attention with her movements and her stretching, and she knew it, trying to put me at ease, I guess. In the end, I told her that I thought Daddy would love it and that it seemed to please everyone because it was met with a round of applause. Now, for half an hour, we sat there awkwardly as I avoided asking about Daddy or their rotting cargo, and instead tried to direct the conversation back to music. Now, I soon began to suspect that they weren't attending this Kiss concert at all, and this is what snapped me out of my stupor. I had to get out of here, and there was no way that I was leaping out of a moving vehicle. Thankfully, these three idiots offered me an opportunity. Further up the highway was a gas station. Will announced that we needed gas, and Janice said that she was craving some beef jerky. Without seeming like my heart was about to explode with terror, I told them that I needed to use the bathroom, like really bad, and so they let me out and I ran to the outdoor restroom. I'm not sure what my plan was from there. Sneak out the back window, sneak into the gas station, and tell them that I was hitchhiking with a bunch of loonies carting around rotten meat who might be part of a satanic cult. I shouldn't have worried. From inside the restroom, I heard the sound of tires peeling away and a vehicle speeding off like their lives depended on it. Considering the VW was the only vehicle in the lot when we got there, I had a feeling that I was the one who'd been ditched. Now, sure enough, when I peeked out of the restroom, the VW was gone. My backpack, which I'd left in the camper in case it looked suspicious, had been thrown into the parking lot, its contents sort of thrown all over the ground. And like a dumb kid, my absolute first concern was to check the wad of money I had in my backpack. I was certain they'd robbed me, but no. Not only had they left all of my money, they specifically removed it from its hidden compartment in my backpack, as if to say, we could have stolen this, but we didn't. I went into the gas station and told the attendant, an older, kindly woman, everything, and I asked her advice, and she was a bit baffled. They hadn't technically committed a crime, but with all the cult crap going on following the Manson family's murder spree and capture, it was fairly obvious that they had something bad in mind, or it could have been an incredibly messed up prank on just some poor kid. And that's what the cops thought anyway. I wouldn't give my name during the call, and I don't think this helped my case, but I had a record and I really did not like cops. They told me it was probably just a prank and I should just count myself lucky, and then they hung up. But it still haunts me to this day. Were they some kind of sicko cult members who worship Manson? Who was this daddy figure? And were they just pranking me, screwing with the kid they picked up on the side of the road? In the years that followed my encounter, I kept an eye on the news for any raids on cult compounds. There seemed to be a few, but I have no way of telling if Janice, Will, and Peter were a part of them. So, I'm from Newcastle, born and raised, but I lived down south in Bristol for a few years now. Just after lockdown was lifted, I decided to take a quick road trip back home to see the parents and my old pals. It was the worst decision of my life and led to the scariest, most death-defying moment I've ever experienced. I was driving down the motorway on the way home, like you do, and I was heading towards an overpass, just one of many, and thought absolutely nothing of it. Why would I? You drive under dozens of these heading cross-country across the United Kingdom. And as I passed under the overpass and out the other side, something came smashing down onto the bonnet of my Ford. It took me a second or two to react, dangerously slow even, and then I realized some effing little effer had dropped a breeze block off of the overpass and right onto my car. Now you hear about this happening sometimes. Gangs of teens are just some dumb kids who don't realize that they're likely to kill someone by doing this. You just never expect it to happen to you. Thankfully, the motorway was pretty deserted and I was able to pull onto the hard shoulder. Now the whole time my car was beginning to smoke and cracks were spiderwebbing up through my windscreen. I pulled over, jumped out, and then winced as I realized that I'd left my phone in the car and had to lean back in to get it out. I'd gotten out a meter or so from the vehicle when the windscreen shattered inwards completely, breaking apart into those sort of chunks of glass that the car windscreens do. Now, immediately I was on the phone with the coppers straight to 999, and I told them what had happened. My voice was shaking and almost cracking from the fact that I'd nearly bloody died. They talked me through everything, whether it was safe to put on my hazard lights and all that kind of stuff, and then they told me that I was the third person in the area to take a hit from that overpass, but the first to suffer such a risky bullseye. Now, I got kind of mad then and asked why they weren't monitoring the overpass to see who was doing this crap, and bless the lady on the phone, she was so patient with me. She explained that they had been monitoring the overpass, but they didn't have the manpower to keep watch 24/7, and I'd gotten extremely unlucky. And so, to their credit, the cops showed up very quickly, cordoned off the area, and then took me to the police station in the nearest town to give a statement. Now, they even gave me vouchers for a travel lodge and a car rental company because my car had to be taken in for forensic evidence. Now, I asked them what they expected to find from a shattered breeze block, and they said that they had to check anyway. And I got a bit suspicious and pressed the issue on this. Turns out that after cordoning my car off and driving me into town, they'd let it abandoned until the tow vehicle got there. In that time, someone had graffitied a cock along the side of the car, as well as opened the door and rifled through my glove compartment. And so they wanted to take the car into the impound and check it for evidence. Well, this process took months, and by then I managed to finally sort out a new car with my insurance company. And eventually, though, I did hear back from the cops. They'd found a couple of fingerprints. Oh, joy, right? Well, the culprits who nearly killed me had been identified, and they were going to get their just desserts. Except they were all under 18, which meant the worst that they could face was a short stint in juvie, and they didn't even get that. I didn't even get to hear about all the details because apparently the culprits were like a lot younger than 18, but basically it was decided that they weren't intending to actually hit any cars or hurt anyone by dropping breeze blocks off of a freaking overpass. And so they got a warning on their criminal record, which will be expunged when they turn 18. And I got to enjoy the experience of nearly dying and then having to spend literal hours on the phone to my insurance company trying to get a payout in a new car. Next time I travel home to Newcastle, I'm taking the bloody train. Hey Joel, I got a quick one for you which happened to me and my family last summer. Now, we were off on a road trip for our summer vacation, something we'd always wanted to do as a family and never had. Now, I'd never do it again either for a whole bunch of reasons. Both the kids arguing constantly, me and the wife arguing constantly, the boring fatigue of driving endlessly, all sorts of reasons. But I think the biggest reason I'd skip out on another road trip vacation was Grandpa. We'd stopped at a national park for a picnic. I forget which one now, the whole thing was a bit of a hectic blur, and what I do remember is when we returned to the parking lot, there was a guy sitting in the back seat of my car. The car had been locked, and to this day I have no idea how he got in. He looked like he was maybe in his mid-20s, but he had extremely pale blonde hair, almost white, something I immediately noticed. I pulled open the door and began demanding, what gives? And he starts talking and calling himself Grandpa, telling us to hurry up and get in so we could get a move on. Now, the kids come over because they were curious, and I was trying to gesture to my wife to take them away while also keeping an eye on this Grandpa character. Now, when he saw the kids, he got excited to see them and told them to hurry up and get in beside Grandpa so we could move on to our next stop. Somehow he knew exactly where we were going next, and that kind of unsettled the crap out of me. Meanwhile, the kids were unsettled because their actual grandpa, my father-in-law, had passed away a couple of months before our vacation. So this weird guy calling himself Grandpa, it kind of confused and scared my kids, both of whom were only 4 and 6 at the time. I slammed the door shut on the guy and began trying to get cell reception to call the cops. All the while I kept my eye on this grandpa when suddenly 2 things happened at once. 1, I actually got reception and my call started to go through to 911. 2, Grandpa pulled some kind of box cutter and began slashing at the back seats, freaking out and screaming. The car was mostly soundproof, but I could hear that he was just yelling gibberish, and for some reason slicing up the seats of my car. I got through to the operator and then the cops, and I was trying to explain what had happened, all while panicking because now this guy had some knife. Now, I remotely locked the car by this point, but it wouldn't be too hard for him to figure out how to let himself out. So immediately I'm telling dispatch that this guy has a knife, and she asks if there's anywhere safe my family can go and lock ourselves in while we wait for the cops to arrive. I remember that there's a restroom in the picnic area, so we all head there. Now, the wife takes our 2 kids and locks them in one stall, while I lock myself in the next one. We're in the women's restroom, and I'm praying that some poor girl doesn't come in and hear me frantically talking to the cops from some locked stall. Thankfully, I hadn't seen anyone else around in the area. I stayed on the phone with dispatch for what felt like a half hour, and eventually an officer came into the restroom and called out that we were safe to exit, but to prepare ourselves. And when I got outside, it was chaos. Our luggage had just been thrown around the entire area. The car had gouges from the box cutter all over it, and as I ran towards the vehicle, an officer tried to stop me, but it was too late. I could smell the smell. Grandpa had defecated on the back seat of the car, a lot, and it absolutely reeked in the summer heat. Now, we were driven to the nearest station. When we arrived, we were informed of the good news. They picked up this grandpa character walking down the freeway, and for some reason he was naked from the waist down and completely unable to explain who he was or why he'd done what he'd done, other than that he was Grandpa. And as you can probably guess, it turned out to be drugs, and as far as I know, he's still in a court-mandated rehab program. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to get involved any further. We gave our statements, and that was kind of that. A cop very kindly offered to speak to his cousin, who ran a car rental firm, to make sure that we could continue our road trip vacation. Now, while it was a very generous offer, I think we were all just too unsettled, scared, and exhausted to take him up on it, and so instead we recovered the few belongings we were sure that Grandpa hadn't soiled on and took the Greyhound bus home. And so yeah, that was my fun little road trip story. It kind of keeps me up at night thinking about how much worse things could have been with my kids around, but maybe writing to you all will exorcise that demon. Screw drug abuse, though, and screw road trips. I just wish that I knew how this lunatic had managed to get into our remotely locked, fairly modern vehicle without any kind of damage to the doors or anything. Now, I think not knowing that drives me more mad than anything else, except worrying about what could have happened to my kids. Hopefully this grandpa guy is getting the help he clearly and desperately needs. I have an absolutely weird thing that happened to me a few years ago. So my brother and I live in different states, a day or so apart, and if we're going to hang out, then that means a road trip. That's fine by me. I love cruising the open road, top down, tunes blaring. I would have loved to have been around during that era of epic music. Oh well, I was born in 2002 and I'm 24 currently if you want to feel old. And so the last rest stop that I'd pulled into, I bought one of those huge Slurpees, which was a big mistake. It was starting to play havoc on my bladder a lot sooner than I expected, and I couldn't see a sign for another rest stop coming up soon. I contemplated pulling over and just letting her rip in nature, but it wasn't exactly a deserted road. No, instead I kept driving, holding it in like a champion. Eventually I saw a small rundown gas station on the side of the road with no real signage, and kind of wondered how they ever even got business. I pulled in, didn't even lower my roof, and just flung myself out the door and ran to the restroom, praying that it wasn't one of those old types where you needed to get the key from the owners. Thankfully, it wasn't. I double-checked that I was heading into the men's room. These days, I'm paranoid about accidentally walking in on some chick and being labeled a predator. Now, thankfully I was, so I headed inside, just about peeing my pants. and all the stall doors were mysteriously closed, and I had the suspicion from the state of the place that they just simply locked the stalls up rather than fix or clean them. Now, why didn't I use a urinal, you ask? Well, there were 3, and every one of them was smashed in some way, and some big out-of-order signs covered the broken porcelain. Well, anyway, the final stall was open sort of ajar, and I figured that this had to be safe at least, and I thought about leaning down to check under the stall for feet, but A, that would mean lying on some sticky floor covered in God knows what, and B, imagine if someone had caught me doing that. Now instead, I just coincidentally pushed the door open, certain that everything would be fine. It was not fine. There was a woman standing on the closed toilet, and she was, to put it mildly, extremely morbidly obese. I could see her body pressing against the stall walls, and I was honestly surprised that she'd managed to get into the stall, let alone climb up into the toilet. She had some brown hair and no makeup, and she was wearing one of those moo-moo things for larger people. Now, confession, I used to be a complete fat ass myself, and I've only begun my gym journey recently, but I'm doing well, I think. And she was staring over my head like she was looking at herself in the bathroom mirror. I looked behind me and saw that the mirror was broken and barely there, so I'm not sure if she was even able to see herself. I called out to her. I couldn't think of what the hell to say to a woman standing on a toilet, so I just sort of said, "Excuse me, ma'am. This is the men's room. The women facilities are next door." And then she looked down at me like she'd noticed me for the first time. Her face was completely expressionless as she stared at me like she was looking straight through me. And despite the comical nature of this situation, there was something intensely creepy about this extremely large woman crammed into a toilet stall, standing on the toilet, looking down at me like she'd never seen a human being before. Now, I had absolutely no idea what to do. The way she was staring at me made me feel like some specimen or potentially a victim. Should I try and help her? Did she even need help? In the end, I decided to say screw it and pulled the stall door shut so I couldn't feel her eyes on me. And then, I'm ashamed to say, my own bladder situation was so bad that I allowed myself to pee in the sink. I kept one eye on the entrance, but if the creepy staring woman caught me, then that was her own fault for being a weird bathroom lurker. And I went into the gas station to tell the owners everything. Well, everything apart from the peeing in the sink aspect. The guy working the register was a bored-looking kid around my age, and I had to repeat myself 3 times before I realized that he had earbuds in. I waved in his face to get his attention, which seemed to annoy him. I told him about the woman in the bathroom and how it had all played out. He sighed and rolled his eyes and said that he was sick of us playing the same prank, so me and my buddies should just knock it off. I tried to explain I wasn't even from the area and it wasn't a prank, and if he'd just go look, he could see for himself. He pointed out that this would leave the store completely unattended, and I told him I'd come with him. Now he countered with the fact that I could have accomplices. I told him to lock up, and in the end he got pretty angry and told me that he wasn't just going to do anything at all about this made-up nonsense. I glanced out the window, frustrated as hell. And then I saw the huge woman standing by my car, slipping a piece of paper under my wiper. And I started yelling to the cashier that there she was, if he'd just look. And the idiot absolutely flat out refused. He wasn't falling for my crap, quote-unquote, and I begged and pleaded, and eventually he did look. And you know what? By the time this lazy-ass cashier took a look, the woman had squeezed herself into her own comically tiny smart car and zoomed off. I told the cashier that I would take my business elsewhere, with a lot more profanity, and went outside to see what the creepy woman had left on my windshield. Now, it was a note that just read, "Carl will be over at 6, in this very barely legible writing. And the next day, I made it to my brother's. I told him everything that had happened, and he was especially creeped out because the woman sounded word for word like the assistant that we had at kindergarten who'd just been a little slow and who just kind of sat in the corner looking at the kids. Except this would have been maybe 20 years ago, and he was sure that from the description that she sounded the same age. The really creepy part, when at 6 p.m. on the dot, the doorbell rang, and my brother answered it, and it was one of his buddies, Kyle. Not quite Carl, but close enough. But he'd only dropped around to hang out, and that was no mystery really there. And I hung out with my brother for about a week and then headed home. When I reached home, I had a message from my brother. And on his way from leaving my brother's place, Kyle got into a car accident. He had 2 broken legs, but was set to make a full recovery. So was it a coincidence, or did this woman somehow have a premonition of Kyle and not Carl getting into an accident? And if so, why did she tell me what time he'd be visiting? I don't believe in the paranormal. I think it was weird and a creepy coincidence where we can see patterns where there was none. But I can tell you one thing. I never use public restrooms anymore, and I'd rather get caught peeing in the public than open a stall door and see that woman standing on the toilet, staring blankly over my head.